going to speak about Django and Angular, and before I kind of get into the presentation, just want to get a sense of how many people are, or have developed in Django and Django REST framework. Okay, a good portion of you guys. What about adding on and a mix of Django, Django REST framework, and Angular? All right, awesome. So yeah, so really the assumption for this presentation is that everybody kind of has a basic understanding of how Django works, how Django REST framework works, and a little bit of an understanding of how Angular kind of works conceptually. Because really at the end of this presentation, I just want to give kind of an intro to how to make all three work together to provide basically a better user experience for the website that you've built. So let's go ahead and get started. So, the first thing is, who am I? I've been developing software for quite some time. I've been in the corporate world. I've done a lot of government contracting work as well, and currently working on a startup that will make life easier taking care of your automobile. So if that's kind of your thing, come talk to me. And it's all built on actually Django, Django REST, and Angular, and some other things too. So let's go ahead and get to the point. So Django is a great framework. It's got a lot of stuff in it. But what it boils down to is really the user experience if you're using pure Django when you're deploying a website. It's kind of old school. Each different click or each action is a full HTTP request. There's a full page load, things like that. And really nowadays, JavaScript is pretty much the future in terms of web UI, UX, and that sort of thing. So, Angular is one of the frameworks, the particular one that we'll talk about today. There's certainly other ones such as Ember, and a whole slew of others. So intermixing those two together will really enhance kind of the product that you're building or the project that you're working on. So how do we make it happen? So really Django will be transformed into essentially more or less your backend. So pretty much all the models, the tables that you've created will live in the Django world. Django REST framework will be kind of your middle layer or your middleware that'll expose that data out to the outside world. You can use it for an Angular project, you can use it for a mobile integration, whatever, depending upon the problem that you're trying to solve or the stack that you're building. So Angular, is mainly a front-end JavaScript framework, and that's kind of where it's going to be. It's going to live outside of those two. So for the purpose of this presentation, I've gone and downloaded an existing kind of small Django app called Django Polls. You can get it at this GitHub URL, or if you have pip, you can install it through that. So I think, when I started doing this, one of the problems that I was having is that there wasn't kind of like a mapping from one to one. It's like, okay, if I have this Django app, how do I convert that over? And so something like that would have been really helpful for me to try to learn how to actually make this happen. So after this presentation, I'll certainly publish the slides, and I could even upload the source code on GitHub so that you guys can really compare the code base between this app that you can get off of pip and kind of what we built today. So step number one is let's go ahead and set up the back end. Basically, it's going to be a mix of obviously the Django Polls web app and Django REST framework. And as you all are well aware, Django REST framework is it's a great tool. It's got a lot of stuff in it. One of the most powerful aspects of it, especially during development, is web browsable API. So if you do publish endpoints, you have a way to kind of test it out, things like that. It's coupled with a bunch of authentication stuff, including OAuth 1 and 2. It's highly customizable if you want. There's a ton of documentation, and there's a huge community online for it if you do run into problems. So let's go ahead and define some models. And this was directly taken from the Django Polls app. I haven't changed anything, so it's really just static from that app itself.
Utilize your side screens.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me, by the way, in the back? Am I talking pretty loud? Okay, great. So the first model that we'll go ahead and talk about is the polls model. There's only really two attributes. It's a question and description. We have some helper functions to determine some business logic that you'll see will make sense a little bit later. The second model is a choice. So that basically ties into the vote. So choice is nothing more than a relation to a poll, as well as some sort of description on whatever you're choosing to vote on. And then obviously the vote is the actual table that'll house the relationship between the two models I talked about previously. So, it takes in a user, it correlates that to a specific poll, and then whatever you actually chose for that specific poll. So once we have the models defined, we need to make these available to the outside world in the form of an API. And so Django REST Framework comes with the concept of serializers, which, if you guys aren't too familiar with Django REST Framework, you can think of serializers as almost like Django forms, where a lot of the input validation can happen and things like that. So for each of the models, we'll go ahead and create a serializer for those specific models. And Django REST Framework allows us to really do it fairly quickly with its model serializer class. So we'll go ahead and instantiate that. And you'll see here that for each of the models, we define a corresponding serializer. And typically, just by defining this class and also what model it is, it'll grab all the fields that you've defined in the model. But for our purposes, what we want to do is if you guys remember in the previous model, we had some of these helper classes, and so that ties into kind of the UI of the Django Polls app. And so over here in the serializer, we're defining some additional read-only fields that correspond to some of those helper functions that were defined in the models. And so this allows us to kind of extend the functionality of the serializer and things like that, and will allow us to really output a little bit more information to the APIs than, say, the traditional model itself. So we have a number of choices, total votes, able to vote, and then the other two are pretty much just same sort of deal. A choice serializer as well as a vote serializer. So once we have the serializers in place, we want to go ahead and create some views that'll really finalize kind of the API. And so, for each of the models, we're going to go ahead and create a corresponding view set, which will define kind of the endpoints of how to expose this data. So I don't want to go too much into detail, but this is pretty much standard Django framework stuff. Query set, it's like, okay, well, what table, what's the query set that this view needs to operate on, what serializer class is associated with, and for our purposes, the permission classes, you can define other classes for that too, but for us, we'll just go ahead with the standard kind of is authenticated, just to make sure that our app is protected and that sort of thing. Nothing too complicated there. I do want to talk a little bit about these two additional functions. So these were derived directly from the model view set class. And the only reason why I included these there is because in the business logic of the Django Polls app, they've kind of included some extra stuff in their views. And so I wanted to just include that here to make sure that the new app that we're creating maps to the way that the old app actually works. And so really what we're doing here is the retrieve function maps to, say, for example, if you want to get a specific object that has like ID number 5. What we want to do is we want to make sure that when it gets returned or when your API gets called, that it appends this able to vote field to that data set. And that really just determines whether or not the user has voted on this particular poll or not. So this pertains, the retrieve function pertains to a specific object, when you actually call the API. And the list function, pertains to, say, if you want to get all the polls, for example, it'll append the same able to vote type of field into that as well. So there's not too much going on there, except for the fact that I'm just creating or basically injecting the value of this function that's associated to the actual model object into that field. So we have, in addition to the poll view set, we do have a choice view set and a vote view set. And the only thing I want to kind of talk about is this get query set function. What it's doing is it's going to allow the API to be able to filter choices based on polls. So you can pass in like a poll as a URL argument, and it'll basically query based on whatever you pass in terms of the poll. And then the view set, that's pretty static. There's nothing crazy there. Except for when it creates a new object, it'll grab the specific user that's actually logged in and associate that to the actual vote. So to finish off the APIs, we just need to define some URLs to allow users to hit the endpoints. And so Django REST Framework allows us to do that pretty easily and seamlessly through its default router. So it'll automatically create basically all the endpoints for your GET and posts and all that stuff, and pretty much do a lot of the work for you. In addition, what I also want to do, and we'll talk about this in a second, is I also want to define an extra URL for an index page, and we'll get to that in a second. But I do want to highlight that for now, just keep that in the back of your mind. So basically, at this point, you will have an actual API that you can browse through the web browsable API as part of the Django REST framework. So at this point, you've defined kind of your backend. Everything's pretty much done. So the next step is really to define the front end, and that's kind of where I want to spend most of this presentation on. Is how do we make Angular work? But before I get into that, I think a lot of people are well aware of what Angular really is. It's an open source Java MVC framework, and one of the main purposes is that it's supposed to decouple the DOM manipulation logic from the app logic and decouple client-side code from server-side code. And one of the most powerful features of Angular, as everybody knows, is the whole concept of two-way binding through scope. There's a ton of documentation that's published, and there's a huge community out there if you run into trouble as well. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to find the Angular app itself. And so there's a couple gotchas that you need to be aware of when you want to enable an Angular app with Django. So the first thing is that the template tags for Angular, when it renders the templates, actually shares the same sort of symbols as Django, which are the curly braces. And so if you don't change the tags, or there's another option of using verbatim, which I personally don't like because then it makes it really confusing. But if you don't change the tags, Django could get really confused as to what sort of variables it needs to inject itself when it starts to render the page. So the first portion of the code is really to define a separate set of tags to tell Angular, okay, for this particular variable or whatever, let Angular handle it, and then let Django kind of skip over it. So what we're going to define, instead of curly braces, we're going to just define brackets. So open and close brackets will define what's for Angular. The curly braces will still be Django. Will still live in Django world. The other thing that I also want to mention is that Django, as you guys should know, love trailing slashes. It's kind of a part of it. So, and by default, Angular strips it, and that could make certain things complicated and not work properly. So there's a small little property that we can set to false that'll just disable that function to actually happen and just allow for the trailing slash to exist. And that's pretty much what this second section does in terms of the app config, is it just disables that whole removal of the trailing slash. And then finally, CRF is pretty powerful in terms of protecting cross-site forgery and things like that. And so what we want to do is we want to signal to Django, all right, what header to include and where to go look for the cookies and things like that. So that's really what the last section is for. So I think those are really the most important things to kind of configure your app initially to make sure that it works well with Django. So the next thing that we need to do is we have a bunch of APIs that we just created and a bunch that correspond to models and the data in our back. What we need to do is we need to tell Angular, okay, how do we want to interact with these APIs? How do we want to manage and kind of encapsulate that sort of logic? And one of the best ways is to use Angular resources. It allows us to basically just write a few pieces of code that allows us to reference APIs as essentially objects in our Angular code. So what we're doing here is we're using a concept called factories in Angular. We're naming it poll, and we're giving it we're using the resource module, and we're giving it basically the URL for the actual endpoint that we created in the previous slides. And you'll notice that in addition to the URL, there are a couple of additional things such as ID. And what that essentially means is, during your code, you may want to inject some IDs into it. And so it just tells it, okay, well, this parameter actually maps to that. So that way you can say, okay, well, you know what? If I want to reference a poll that's with ID number 5, we can do that. And it'll make sense a little bit later. And essentially, vote is the same exact deal. So for now, we're going to just make sure Angular understands that there's two main objects that we want to be able to reference in our code. Number one, the poll, and number two, the vote. So the next step that we want to do is define the controller, which is essentially the business logic of this app. And what this is going to do is, number one, the way that we define it, what you could do, for the simplicity of today's presentation, I've just pretty much included all this code into one app.js. Usually what you'll want to do is segment that out into different controller files and then include those in your app configuration. But just for now, what we're doing is we're telling the app, okay, this is the controller that we're defining. It's called polls list controller. We're going to go ahead and use some existing modules such as scope. We define a poll resource, a vote resource, and we're going to also use the HT module that comes with Angular. So the first thing that we're doing in this controller, excuse me, is when this controller gets executed.
I have a question. So you said something like you take out the controller and put it in like another file, right?
Yeah.
In your experience, like how did you structure out like your Angular application? Because like with Django, there's like kind of a strict, you put in modules, you have a folder there, and you put in your models and your views. But with Angular, though, it's kind of different. Is it more of like their file structure, kind of like Rails, or would you, like, in your experience, like, in terms of, like, having features that, or you put, like, controllers and then only a bunch of your controllers there? Like,
So I think it really depends on the project that you're dealing with. If it's a pretty small project and there's not too many controllers, I don't see a reason not to put it in one controller file. But if you're running with, say, 10 different controllers, I would segment them out. And I would define a specific controller in a separate file and basically reference it back in your app's config just to include that as well.
Okay.
And the way that Angular will understand that kind of breakdown is you'll have to include certain files in your HTML file, and then that'll allow Angular to load up the appropriate resources to understand that when you are including stuff, it knows where to find it.
Well, related to that, is there, because like Rails has the concept of being able to bundle all the JS's into one file. Does Django support that as well?
I mean, you certainly could. There's nothing wrong with that. I think from a development standpoint, it makes it a lot harder to maintain because then you have to like go through one file and tons of code. You could run some
Well,
sort of,
I mean, but what also doesn't work is to have the index template have like each individual JS file that you need to pull in for your template or for your Angular application.
Right. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it depends. Like if your website has a ton of different areas or different functions, then what you could potentially do is have each different function be its own separate app, right? Versus just have like one massive app. So you could do it that way, but if it's relatively small, then there's really no reason not to include it in one index file. But again, like I said, if your web app has like 4 major areas, I would probably say split those up into 4 different Angular apps, and then include whatever files you need to include in those various index files that correspond to the separate apps.
in terms of maintaining like four Angular apps, right? How has it been like in your experience? Like, has it been a headache? Because like I was also reading in Ember of like if you wanted to make ambitious like Trello, right? Like a lot of moving parts of it and all that stuff. Like with Angular though, do you see it's just like four major apps, or use like another framework? Like how did you figure out like which front-end framework to choose from?
So I think there's a couple questions there. I guess the first one I want to address is when choosing a framework, it really depends on the problem, right?
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two is depending upon the complexity, which framework has the biggest community around it, because you're going to run into issues, and chances are that you're going to have to go look online or post something somewhere. So you want to be able to have some sort of access to talented people, whether or not they're not within your team or outside. So with those two factors, I think, and obviously feature set, right? So depending upon the problem that you're trying to solve, does this framework actually facilitate or resolve the problems that you're having? But in terms of organizing the code, so one of the things that I developed has like 6 different sub-apps, and so those to me are pretty much very independent Angular apps. And so I've never had a problem actually segmenting those out because ideally they should just be independent themselves. And so, because of, as long as you encapsulate it well, it's not going to be too much of a problem. But again, it depends on your project and kind of like how you're used to organizing your code. Any other questions so far? Okay. So back to this simple example of a controller. So what we're doing right now is the first thing that we're going to do is populate the polls lists, which we're assigning to this scope variable. And this will make a little bit more sense in a second. But what scope allows us to do is it facilitates that whole two-way binding concept, which allows us to say, okay, if we're going to change some data in our controller, it's going to automatically reflect on our front-end HTML web page. And so what we're doing here is we're taking that resource that we defined called poll, which corresponds to that API that we created, and it says, give me all the polls, and assign it to this polls variable that we'll be able to reference in our actual Angular templates when we actually want to render them and present it to the user. The next thing is this polls detail. So I kind of wish I inserted a couple additional slides in here, but basically, if you can think about this standard Django polls app, all it is a list of polls. You click on one, it does a full page refresh, and it gives you some details of that specific poll that you clicked on. And so instead, what we want to do is we want to transform that UI to say, instead of a full page refresh, just give me the poll that I clicked on and just refresh a portion of the page. And so over here, what I'm doing is I'm taking a specific variable and saying, okay, well, if a user clicks on it, I want to populate this. So we're just defining kind of an empty placeholder just for organization perspective. And then also for data, this will make a little bit more sense in a second, but data represents like when a user actually submits some data, when he chooses to vote on a poll, this is what's going to get populated. And so back to polls detail, I'm defining a function that when a user clicks on a poll, it will actually grab the specific poll ID from the link, go get the details of it, and then assign it to this poll details object that will render it on the page itself. So that way it's not a full page refresh, rather only a segment of the page, and the specific poll that you chose is going to get outputted to the UI. So HTTP GET, what it's doing is it's going to go reach out to this URL. We're passing in a poll ID, and then because of the way that JavaScript works, it's asynchronous. There could be a delay, right? It's not going to just execute automatically. So we have to it's essentially a promise. We have to wait until it's successful. When it's successful, we're going to go ahead and assign this variable poll detail, which we defined up here, to what the actual poll that gets resolved based on this get over here. And then if there's like an error, it just throws an alert that says, sorry, an error occurred. So depending upon your project, you'll have a set of instructions to do once the request is actually filled, versus if your API errored out for some reason, you would have some other logic that you could actually execute down here. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so in addition to just grabbing the details of a poll, we also want to put in some logic to submit a poll. So if there's a question and we want to submit an answer to it, we want to define another function to be able to facilitate that. So what we're doing here is we're creating a new vote object, and if you remember, the vote object we defined as an Angular resource that maps to our vote API. We're inputting some user data that is based on somebody clicking through the different choices of the poll. We're passing in a dummy value of vote user to bypass kind of the serializer requirements. I don't recommend doing this, but just for the purpose of today's presentation and converting the static Django polls app, this was the easiest way to do it. But basically what we're doing is we're just kind of bypassing the serializer requirements, because I'll show you in a second that actually this value for the vote is dynamically assigned within the business logic in the API backend. So this is almost, it doesn't even matter what we assign here, it's just for the purpose of validation. And then what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, once this object has been filled up with user data, we want to go ahead and call the save method, which is a predefined function that is defined as part of the Angular resource library. And so it creates a new object using our API backend that we had defined. So after the user enters in their information, we go ahead and call a save method. If everything works out great, what we want to do is we want to refresh kind of the values on the page. So number one, we want to set the able to vote attribute to false, because what happens is that depending upon this variable, it'll either allow a user to submit a vote, or it'll just display, you know what, these are the current numbers for it. And then secondly, we want to make sure that we update the actual counts of the votes, because that's what's going to be displayed for the page. And so what this saves us to do is, if we didn't have this, then we would have to actually make an additional request back to the database and say, give me the updated numbers. So what we're doing is we're just updating the values on our side to save that whole database hop that would have to happen. And then obviously if there's a function, you know, you can do whatever you want. We're just outputting it to the console. You can put in an alert message, whatever your app actually needs to handle errors.
I had a question. So that only changes like that one part of it. So like, let's just say you add in, and then that changes that only one tidbit that you saved it, right? For that one, for when you do a success, when it like returns a 200.
Right. So this code gets executed on success.
Okay.
So you can do whatever you want in there, depending upon whatever you do.
I actually had a question on the last one. I'm actually doing something similar at work where we had to. So we're using Angular and like if we go to like another URL, like Angular forces the request to be finished. So for that previous one, for that then that like when you go to another URL, that cancels out that previous request. Is that like what it does?
So you're saying that
the previous slide, sorry. When you make promises and stuff. Sorry.
Okay, got it. So you're saying that within a promise, you're executing another request to some other resource, right?
Yeah, like let's just say like you go to for the tabs, right? You are like requesting something. It's kind of long, and then let's just say that you want to go to another URL. For that like previous request, does Angular cancel that out, or
no?
Like
so what's going to happen is like, let me go back to that. So I guess you're talking about within here, right? Say for example over here, you want to make another request back to your database, or back to the API.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen is that this will get executed, and then once this is done, your next get will get executed, and then basically whatever you define to be your success for that will get executed whenever that finishes.
Oh, so it doesn't do like cancel, so that code
so
right
it's
there
not going to omit it.
Oh, okay.
However, you have to think about how long it's going to take, or usually it's not a good idea to just continuously nest these things. So you may want to just figure out a way how to not do that.
Yeah.
But if you were going to do it that way and there's no other way, it would essentially wait to execute that code until those two things were. So if you had a nested get inside this get, whatever code for the success would get executed when that first success got completed. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? It's just going to continue. It's going to wait until it's done. It's not going to say you can't make any more.
Yeah.
So theoretically, yeah, you could make like 100 get requests if you wanted.
Oh, it's not inside of it. Sorry, it's not inside of like that code right there.
Oh.
It's like in another. So say on the tab right here. So it's like.
Oh, so you're saying you're doing a get here and you're doing a get here.
So it just says the user, right? So the user like clicks on that URL, and then let's just say they got bored. They go to home again. I'm just wondering if like for that code right there, does that like forces that to like continue like for it to be success? Like because I know like Angular. For promises, they're pretty like strict on like making sure that the request is made, right? You can't just like cancel out that request even though they went for the user goes to home. Like it waits until that request is finished.
So if your home is defined as like a completely different app or a different page, then your request essentially dies.
Oh, okay.
So you have to still be within kind of that context of Angular for it to continue making the request that you want.
Okay.
But if you go outside of that, then it's just going to cancel it.
Okay.
Okay, so after we define our controllers, we want to go ahead and start to define, how's our UI going to look? And I think this goes back to, your question, that, all right, if you have a ton of Angular apps and stuff like that, like, do we want to just include everything? Usually the method that I use is to encapsulate as much as possible and segment and stuff like that. So for our purposes, what we want to do is if we just have a very simple kind of app or a modular app, we want to include Angular, obviously. And just to kind of talk a little bit about how this works in the Django world, is Angular, conceptually, it's like all the code is going to be rendered and interpreted on the client side. And Django, traditionally, it goes through a template engine, and all the rendering of the HTML pages happens on the back end and then gets pushed out to the user. And so, usually, for a Django Angular app to work, at least the base index page needs to be rendered for it to, number one, serve all of these JS files. And so really, the index page is what the Django template engine is going to render initially. And then from there, we'll talk about, okay, well, how do we push out the Django templates outside the template engine? So right now, for the index page, that's going to run through the Django template engine. And as you can see, we're getting the static stuff. We're including the Angular files, as well as our app.js, which defines our entire Angular app. And then, this piece of code right here is just saying, okay, well, whatever else that we defined in terms of the subsets of our project, put it right here. So Django will render this page, serve it to you, and basically any sort of subsequent Angular templates will get inserted into this div UI view set of tags. So now that we have an index page that's kind of tied to Django, Django is going to be serving the index page. It's going to send all the users the various JavaScript files that it requires to actually run this app. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and define at least one, for our purposes, a polls.html file. And one thing that I do want to note is that the index file is located in the templates directory that's defined in your Django project. However, this HTML file, since it's an Angular world, it may not work as nicely living in that same template file, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that the user gets this file as part of kind of being, similar to the way that like Django would serve a static file. So right now what I'm doing is I'm putting this partial HTML Angular template file in the static directory of Django. So that way it knows, okay, when Angular is starting to interpret the Angular app on the client side, it knows, okay, well, I need to go and get this, and essentially Django is just going to serve it as is. It's not going to run through the Django template engine or anything. So the first thing that we want to do in this HTML file is we want to define a controller that corresponds to dealing with the actions of this HTML page. So that's how to do it. It's this ng controller tag. You define the polls list controller that we defined in the previous screen. And so the first part of this is just, it's providing a full list of the polls that when you access the page, it's going to make that query request to get all the polls. And what we're doing is this ng repeat tag is just like a for loop. So for every poll in the list of polls, I want to go ahead and create another a list item, and then have like a link and display the actual question that's associated with the poll. So you can think of it as that, okay, once you hit the page, it's going to be a list of polls, and it's going to have a list of all the questions associated and a specific link associated to the actual poll. And instead of an actual hard-coded link, what we're going to do is we're going to tell Angular, okay, anytime somebody clicks on that link, it's going to call the function that we had defined in the controller in the previous slide called viewPollDetail. And so viewPollDetail will get executed with the poll object that we were essentially iterating through, and it will kind of do what it needs to do. So I'm just going to go back a few slides. So remember when we defined this viewPolls function here? So one of the first the only argument is the poll, and so we're basically operating on that poll object, and we're getting the choices based on that poll. So that's how this ties to the user action from the template perspective, is that you can actually tell Angular, okay, anytime a user clicks on something or whatever, you can tell it, okay, execute this function right here. So that's what we're doing here. And so this polls detail page, this is kind of where we're going away from that static kind of, every time somebody clicks on a link in the original app, it would do a full page refresh. Now, when you click on a poll, it'll only do a partial refresh based upon the function that we defined. So when we actually do and get a poll detail object, it'll go ahead and render this code and output all this stuff over here. So essentially what we're doing is we are listing out the actual title of or the question of the poll, and then depending upon whether or not we're able to vote. And able to vote, remember, it was that extra field that we had added to that serializer class to determine whether or not I had already voted on a poll or not. If I did vote on a poll, then that means I can't vote again, so just output kind of the results. And if I can vote on a poll, what I want to do is be able to provide a way to vote, which in our case is going to be just a set of radio buttons and then a submit button to actually submit our vote. So now that we define an Angular app, we define a set of resources that map to our REST framework, we define a set of templates that renders the UI. What we need to do is we need to tell Angular, okay, well, once it loads everything, like how do we know where to go depending upon the state of the app? And so what Angular provides, a method for us to do that is called state provider, which essentially tells us that every time someone clicks on a URL through our Angular app, it essentially tells Angular, okay, which controller to use, number one, and number two, which template do we want to render. So for this app, what we're telling it to do is when it accesses just the base URL, we want to go ahead and instantiate the polls list controller, and we want to render that polls.html that we just went over. So at this point, Django doesn't really know anything about this, and this is all happening on the client side. So Angular provides this, and all this configuration goes in your app.js that you define all your URL mappings and stuff like that. And that's what really makes this kind of function independently of the entire Django framework and how the template engine works and how the URLs maps work and all that stuff. This kind of encapsulates your Angular app into its own little entity. Any questions so far? Okay, so with this simple example, pretty much what we've gotten is basically, we've transformed a static polls app that every time you click on this link, it would do a full page refresh, go back to the database, it'd have to re-render everything, Django would have to run through its template engine, and then output a bunch of other stuff. Now when we click on a link, it just automatically refreshes this bottom page. So it's a partial refresh. It'll make your apps, obviously this is kind of a contrived example, but in the real world situation, you don't necessarily want to do a full page refresh. So this makes it really easy to be like, okay, if I click on how are you, it's only going to refresh this portion. And you know what, if I hadn't vote, it would just show me basically a way to vote, and I could click submit. So that's pretty much really how to make Django and Angular work together. It's fairly simple, and obviously, as your web application scales out, there are complexities that go along, but essentially, just these few configurations and kind of reorganization of code and kind of, the templates and things like that will allow you to kind of make your existing Django app into a little bit more friendly UI and UX experience. So that's pretty much it. Are there any additional questions, discussions? Yeah? Go ahead.
Did you take any consideration of making the Angular app completely separate from your Django app and not rendering it through Django templates?
Yeah, so one of the things one of our projects is doing is, say for example, doing a hybrid kind of mobile app using Angular, and so that is completely independent from Django completely. And so one of the ways that we allow that to happen is through, So somebody could just render all their pages, but the problem is okay, how do you authenticate and things like that, right? So in our case, what we're using is JWT, so token authentication, and so using that, it allows somebody to just basically function as like a client, thus skipping over the entire Django template engine entirely, and then just using the token for each of the requests that it makes back to the APIs. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I saw you did an explicit get when you were pulling down an individual pull. So you're hitting the Django REST framework there. When you're doing the save, I didn't see an explicit post or put or anything like that. Is that handled by the resource?
Exactly.
It's
Yeah, so I wanted to put both in, just an example. So, I mean, you could certainly do HTTP post if you want, but the resource really handles a lot of that for you.
Did you have to do the explicit get, or could you just...
No, so we could have done, we could have defined another resource entirely.
Okay.
And then instead just done a get. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things I've always had to grapple with when I'm integrating like Angular with Django and Flask is the propagation of settings or routes to the client. In the case of, hey, this is like 4 directory levels deep in a URL or something. So the way I've done it is I've usually kind of, in my template, rendered the overall like Flask or Django configuration as a JSON object that gets read by a configuration provider.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a more elegant way of doing that with the specific stack of pulling down configuration that's defined on the server side, not necessarily with JavaScript, but with like Python configuration object, and putting that in your Angular application?
So right now you're basically passing the configuration as a JSON after the Angular app has been rendered and functioning?
Yeah.
And you're asking, is there a better way of doing that?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, what have I done? I don't know, I'll think about it. So a lot of the, I've actually gone the same route. Is that if there is additional stuff that needs to be kind of passed to the other side, yeah, like I've exposed that as some sort of API and passed it through JSON and then ingested it that way. I personally tried not to use the template engine too much and intermingle all that stuff, just because then you kind of defeat the purpose of really segmenting out the front layer and the back layer. It's funny because I was talking to Josh earlier today. It's like Django is such a huge framework. I mean, and really, when you're doing something like this, you're kind of like just boiling it down to like nothing but just tables and models. But really, that's kind of the way, you know, if you want to create your app really modular and kind of make sure there's different technology and plug in different things in different ways, it's almost like going that way where it's like you don't want to use a lot of the functions and a lot of the strengths that may have been applicable when it first came out. So yeah, I mean, you know, back to your original question, I think that's a fine way to do it, because the route that I take is like I want to get away from using the template engine as much as possible, just because I think that's really difficult later down the road to say, I don't know, if today I'm using Angular, maybe I want to use Ember tomorrow or something else, then it kind of gets annoying to deal with those nuances. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Special you had to do to integrate with Django off here?
No, so for this purpose, there's really nothing, because the Django REST framework takes care of the authentication. So in the various ways that you define your view sets, you can tell it how you want to handle the authentication. So Django REST framework, in terms of this example, actually takes care of that automatically. So there's nothing really special.
Did your Angular code have to pass like an API key or anything like that?
So because this is using, so like say for example, if you want to completely decouple it and you don't want to use Django at all for like authentication or anything, well not authentication, but you don't want to use the standard authentication module of Django, and you want to say, I don't know, you want to integrate like a mobile app or something like that, you would have to use some sort of token mechanism. And one of the most useful things that I've used is JWT. Mm-hmm. So you basically you take that token and you'd have to provide some additional app configurations to say, with every request, insert this token in this header to allow your backend to understand, okay, well this is the token that's being provided with this HTTP request, is this good or bad? So it's just, if you want to use token-based authentication, you basically just have to provide additional configurations in your app.js configs. Yeah, go ahead.
Does the Angular resource service work as smoothly always as you showed it this time? Like, do you ever run into problems?
So the only annoying thing that I've run into so far is that it doesn't, out of the box, allow you to just say provide put requests. You know what I mean? So like but it's fairly easy to just define how you want to deal with a put request in your resource configurations. But aside from that, I mean, it's pretty decent. I mean, it's got your gets, posts, and stuff, deletes. So as long as you're abiding by a lot of the normal kind of REST standards, then you should be okay.
Does it do patch? HTTP patch. Patch is a partial put.
Right. It does. And what you would need to do. So yeah, I mean, you can, like I said, you can do a put. You just have to manually define it. But more importantly, what you need to do is just make sure that your backend is equipped to handle something like that, depending upon your project. So if there's other actions that need to be done based on that patch or partial put, you just need to make sure that you take into account that. Yeah.
What unit tests did you use for Angular? Did you use the ones that come with Angular, or did you use the ng mocks, or did you use something else?
So the unit test framework that I've used is pretty much standard in Angular documentation, like Jasmine and some of those other things, and Karma. So I find those to be fairly good, and I've just been continuing to use them. And like I said, their documentation online has a lot of good instructions on how to use Jasmine and Karma. Yeah, go ahead.
Have you seen or used any projects that create an Ajax-enabled admin interface for Django?
An Ajax-enabled admin interface. I haven't run across that yet. I still use the standard Django admin interface quite a bit every once in a while, but I've never actually used that as like an actual front end for projects. It's always just been kind of internal things. But no, I haven't really dealt with that yet. Sorry.
I'm new to Django, but most of that you can do with Ajax. Can you talk about some of the key benefits of Angular versus jQuery Ajax?
Yeah. So jQuery. So you can certainly use both if you want. I mean, it's not like one or the other. And I think they do. Both of those do completely different things. Angular, you think about it as more of like a full-fledged framework versus jQuery is just something that makes it easier to do DOM manipulations. Typically, I don't like to do too much of those at the same time, just because Angular allows you to kind of separate that whole logic. With jQuery, you can get into problems. It's like you can put too much logic in DOM manipulations on the front end, and it just gets really tough to debug and kind of be able to unit test and things like that. So, so I try to keep those separated as much as possible, but again, it just depends what you're trying to do.
I didn't see any listeners defined anywhere. Is Angular, you don't have to do that with Angular. If you define a variable and you change that variable, Angular is just going to automatically detect and refresh that part of the page automatically, without wiring up any kind of listener?
Yeah, so Angular does a good job at two-way binding, and what you have to do is in your controllers, you have to make sure that you pass in what they call scope, and that'll take care of basically that's essentially the context of that essentially that realm. So there's nothing extra that you need to do. So as long as you put in the scope variable in your controller definition and map the template accordingly, then everything works this way. That's like one of the magics of Angular, I guess. Yeah.
So I tried to use Angular, and the thing I didn't like a lot is that you have to hard code all your URLs and pass to static files. Is there any way to do like Django name of URLs or static shortcut?
So one way what you could do is So like, yeah, for example, if you have URLs all a bunch of places in your Angular app, what you could do is you could define a constants file that says, okay, for this, you could define URLs there, and then that way you could just essentially just include variables pertaining to those URLs in various places in your Angular code. So that way it's just one location to maintain.
Okay. Have you checked out Angular 2.0?
I haven't played around with it too much yet. It's still in, alpha and beta stage, so
Okay.
I haven't played around with it.
Are you worried? I don't know. Just wondering.
No. Anything else? All right, well, thanks so much for your time. And I'll be posting the slides, so if you guys have any additional questions or whatever, definitely feel free to reach out to me. Thanks a lot.